In this final recording of our series about nonfiction, we're going to talk about how you can use nonfiction in your classroom. So one way you can incorporate nonfiction is as a read aloud. Certainly, as we've discussed before, nonfiction has a lot of benefits, like introducing students to different text structures, different vocabulary, and it also builds their background knowledge about the world, which will in turn, enhance their reading comprehension. So reading aloud nonfiction is an excellent idea. Just like you would read aloud works of fiction, nonfiction works too. You can also use nonfiction as mentor text during your writing workshop. I know that in a previous video we talked about how much of the nonfiction of today is just beautifully written and can serve as a model of excellent writing for our students. Like when I read a passage from Candace Fleming's The Family Romanov, we talked about how that particular passage had a lot of artistic merit that you might want to share with students so that they could learn how to incorporate vivid details in their own writing, just like Candace Fleming did in that passage from The Family Romanov. You can also use nonfiction as sources that students can consult and read if they're doing reports about a topic in your class or if they're doing a presentation. And sometimes if you collaborate with your school librarian, the librarian will pull a number of books from the library to and kind of loan them to your classroom as students are working on their projects about particular topics. For example, when I taught fourth grade, the students learned a lot about the different states in the United States as part of social studies. So I knew that I could count on the librarian to pull books about the different states and the different regions of the U.S. and lend them to my students for a long period of time as we were focusing on that unit. And certainly you can use nonfiction as a way to introduce new content and build students' background knowledge. When I was introducing a new unit of study in science or social studies, and sometimes even with math, I would always start the unit by reading a children's book, reading a nonfiction book that related to the topic that we were going to be studying. So that way students could begin activating their prior knowledge or begin building their knowledge to help prime them for the additional information that was to come in the unit. So nonfiction is a great way to introduce a new unit of study. And nonfiction can also help supplement the curriculum because oftentimes nonfiction books for children talk about topics that are we often don't read about in our history books or our science books, and they often offer a different perspective. For example, in social studies in school, we often learn about the civil rights movement and especially school integration as well as integration of public facilities. And a lot of the times when we learn about that topic, we learn about how violent it was and how opposed people were, at least many white people were, to integration and how that caused a lot of conflict. Like we get this we get a sense that integration was very violent, and certainly it was in a lot of places. And that history is certainly something students need to know about. But not every community had that kind of violent narrative in terms of integration of schools and public facilities. Like this book here, Seeds of Freedom, is about how Huntsville, Alabama actually integrated in a very peaceful manner compared to a lot of other communities in Alabama and elsewhere in the South. So I like this book because it provides a different perspective. Like there were cases where people worked together to make integration happen without having violent conflicts. So I really like seeking out books like that because they provide a different view of history. So there are a number of ways that you can promote students' comprehension of nonfiction texts. One way that is really effective is to have students preview the text before they actually begin reading it. Previewing the text could include reading the table of contents to get a sense of what general topics the author is going to address. You can also have students flip through the book and read headings because headings also signal what topics are going to be addressed in the book, so that can help students activate their prior knowledge about the topic. And then you can also have students look at visuals like any photographs or illustrations, diagrams, maps to help them think about what they already know about that topic. With nonfiction, it's also really important that you teach explicitly text features, things like captions, sidebars, the glossary, because a lot of students are not familiar with reading nonfiction and don't realize that nonfiction has text features that we don't typically find in narrative works like fiction. So in order for students to have the best possible comprehension of nonfiction, we need to teach them about different text features and their functions. And I'm actually going to post this video to Blackboard about, I think it's a first grade teacher who does a lesson about teaching text features to her students. And I think that it's well done, and I think that it might give you some ideas of how you might introduce text features in your own classroom. Also, there are some questioning strategies that you can teach students to promote their comprehension of nonfiction books. So I'm also going to provide this link in Blackboard for you so you can learn what some of those strategies are. And then there's a strategy that I really like called Text Masters. So Text Masters is basically literature circles, but students, instead of using works of fiction, actually read nonfiction books or textbooks. So with Text Masters, students assume different roles and they rotate their roles, you know, every time they have a different meeting. Like the discussion director will ask good questions of the people in the group. And in literature circles in our class, like all of you are acting as the discussion director in a sense because you're all sharing your questions, but your group leader is kind of in charge of that. The summarizer will write a brief summary of whatever students have read prior to the literature circle meeting. The webmaster is a student who's in charge of creating like a graphic organizer that portrays important information that was communicated in the text. And that job is kind of difficult, but it's also a creative job because you know, it can be challenging to figure out what information is the most salient and what's the best way to communicate that visually. And the vocabulary enricher is a student who identifies important vocabulary words, words that might need to be defined, and shares what those words mean. So, and I'll share with you at the end of this video where you can actually find the article about Text Masters if it's a strategy that you're interested in using in your classroom one day. And certainly book discussions about nonfiction don't have to occur in a face-to-face classroom setting. Oftentimes you can take book discussions online if you work in a district where most students or all students have computers in the home, or if they have access to a computer lab. For example, you might be familiar with the website Edmodo. Edmodo, I think of it like a cross between Facebook and Blackboard. And you can do it a lot on Edmodo. You can like upload assignments and you can post announcements for your students, but you can also create spaces for students to have discussions, asynchronous discussions. So it has like a discussion board. So students could post questions and respond to each other online outside of class. So that's something to think about. All right, so this concludes our series about nonfiction in the elementary classroom. I just wanted to give you a list of some sources that I consulted in putting this together. And the article I just mentioned about Text Masters was published in the Journal of Adolescent and Adult Literacy. It was volume 53 in issue number 2. So if you're interested in that, you can certainly get it from the USM library. We have access to that. So if you have any questions about nonfiction, let me know.